Okay, so um, one really important piece of this is that in the summer of 1775, the Congress decided, this is after Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen had taken Fort Ticonderoga, which is here. They decided, well, why not push into Canada? And the thinking is the Canadian people will welcome being brought into this rebellion against the British Crown. Remember, Britain had only acquired Canada back in 1763. Before that, it had been a French colony. And the thinking is that why wouldn't Canada want to join in this rebellion? And so Congress, though, takes a while to decide how exactly to go about doing this invasion of Canada, not really thinking of it as an invasion. The thinking is that just as British authority has collapsed in the other colonies in North America, once the Americans make common cause with the Canadians, British authority also will collapse there. But that doesn't happen for a couple of reasons. The major one, I think, is, let me show you who is actually leading the charge here. The two generals in charge of this expedition, the man on the left, I'm not sure if you can see this with the screen here. This, of course, is Benedict Arnold, who had gone up to Fort Ticonderoga. And now Arnold builds boats on Lake Champlain to conduct the war, bring the war into Canada, bring troops into Canada initially. And then this is Richard Montgomery. And Montgomery was an English officer. He had served with great distinction in the British Army during the 7 Years' War, serving in North America as well as in Havana, Cuba. And he was Irish, as many officers and soldiers were. And if you're familiar at all with the history of England and Ireland, you know, there isn't always a warm relationship between these two countries. And Montgomery, for some reason in the late 1760s, early 1770s, believes that his chances for advancing in the British Army, where he was an officer, were slim. And so he decides to resign his commission in about 1772, and he remains in North America. He actually marries the daughter of Robert Livingston, who's a prominent New Yorker. And then he is commissioned by the Continental Congress, a brigadier general, to lead the American invasion of Canada, which he does. And the thinking on the part of Congress is we really don't need to send that much of a force because the Canadians will welcome us. That have a couple of problems with this particular strategy. One is this. The governor of Canada was Guy Carleton. And Carleton was a more astute governor than many of the others in British North America. He realized what he needed to do in order to, I apologize for this somewhere here, there's a phone that is ringing. Anyway. Oh, it's in my pocket. Okay. He learned to get along with the people in Canada. There weren't that many. There's maybe 70,000 altogether. The population of the other British colonies was somewhere above 2 million. So this is a relatively small population dispersed over a wide area. And among that population are a lot of Native Americans. And this man is an interesting man named Joseph Brant, who is, as you can probably tell, a Mohawk. A Mohawk warrior. He had studied actually at Dartmouth. A new college opened in New Hampshire to teach Indians. And his sister, Molly Brant, was the long-time, common law wife, I guess you'd put her, of Sir Richard Johnson, of Sir William Johnson, who was the British Commissioner for Native American Affairs in the North. He had a Johnson Hall on the Mohawk River, and Johnson also was adopted as a Mohawk. And so you have this big Native American presence in Canada. And among the Europeans in Canada, probably 2/3 or more are actually French. You'll recall that England and France had been fighting over this area. Most of the population was French. And one reason, or two reasons, I should say, three reasons for the failure of the British attempt to gain Canada was that Carleton was a better governor. I'm not putting these in the order of their importance. Two, there had been a long warfare between the English colonists in British North America and the native people, who now comprise much of the population of Canada. Three, there had been long warfare between the English colonists, particularly in New England, and the French in Canada. So there is a real hostility there. So now when emissaries come from the British colonies to the South saying, hey, why don't you join us? They think, well, actually, things are pretty good now that the British are in charge. I should also say one of the grievances the New England colonists had against the British Crown in 1773, you've probably heard the phrase intolerable acts. This is what the colonists called the closing of the port of Boston and the suspension of the Massachusetts government. Another one of the intolerable acts was the Quebec Act. And by the Quebec Act, the boundary of Quebec was extended to the Ohio River, and the Catholics in Canada are able to continue being Catholics. And the extension of the boundary to the Ohio River really angered the Virginians because they claimed that all of that territory belonged to Virginia. And then secondly, the allowance of Catholicism in Canada infuriated the New Englanders, who saw the Catholic faith as, well, the Catholic faith as the Antichrist. And they were constantly fighting against the Antichrist. So this promises to be not an easy thing for Montgomery and Arnold to get control of Canada. And it isn't. Montgomery actually does, by the mid-fall of 1775, he has taken Montreal. Carleton only has a very small force. And he's actually sent a lot of the Canadian forces available to Boston to help out with the siege there because he doesn't anticipate any real trouble. And for the most part, he is right. And now Montgomery comes with a force that's able to take Montreal. And in fact, General Carleton has to sneak out of Montreal to get to Quebec, which is the real fortress for New France as it had been. And you may recall that in 1759, there was a major battle at Quebec, actually the second biggest battle in the history of North America. Anyone know what the biggest battle in the history of North America was? This could be another good bonus question for someone.
Was it Montreal?
Not Montreal. That's a good guess, though, but thank you for playing, Sean. Yes, James.
Gettysburg?
It is Gettysburg. That's the correct answer. I see Dylan nodding. That's what he was going to say, but didn't. Okay, so Battle of Quebec, and the British take it. Now in late 1775, General Carleton, Governor Carleton, and his forces are concentrated at Quebec as these American forces holding Montreal move upriver. And also, this is another piece of this that I should have mentioned to you. So Montgomery is coming this way, and Arnold actually comes this way, bringing his forces through the wilderness of Maine, hoping to join up with Montgomery. Now, one thing that all of these people fighting this war are going to discover is you can look at a map and see that if you follow the Kennebec River up far enough, ultimately you're going to come to a river that is going, you go over, and it looks like a relatively small area, and then you get onto a river that's going to take you down to the St. Lawrence. Well, turns out there's actually a series of mountains here, and so it's not as easy as it looks on a map. There's actually some great books about this expedition of Arnold through Maine to get up to come to the aid of Montgomery at Quebec. So at the end of the year, Montgomery and Arnold are besieging Quebec against hoping to capture Quebec over the winter, because they know what will happen in the spring when the ice melts on the St. Lawrence River. is the British fleet will come back down and drive them out. But if when they come back down, the Americans hold Quebec, it will give the Americans a much better position. And on the last day of 1775, the American forces led by Montgomery and Arnold tried to storm the fortress at Quebec and fail. And in fact, Montgomery dies in the attempt to storm the fortress, and Arnold is seriously wounded. So they don't take Quebec. They are holding Montreal and wondering what to do next. I should say that while this is happening here, when news of this gets back to England in early 1776, there's a debate in Parliament over this, because on the one hand, you see the forces led by Montgomery actually moving up here. On the other hand, all of these forces in Boston under Howe and so on seem to be bottled up. How come Montgomery is doing so much better than Howe, the guy you sent here? And the fact that, you know, Montgomery once had been one of us is something disturbing. I should say that when the British do move out of Quebec, and they, having driven Arnold and his army away, and now they're making their way back down the river toward Montreal, they do see Montgomery's body. He had died in the siege, and they bury him with military honors because he, after all, had been a British soldier, and they recognize this. And in fact, in Parliament, when Lord North says, well, yes, he might have been heroic and he might have been brave, but he was a rebel, one of the opposition members of Parliament says, in the course of human history, it's been the rebels who have achieved the most. So notwithstanding that, Montgomery is dead, buried outside of Quebec. Later on, his body will be brought back to the United States, what becomes the United States, New York, where he had left his wife. Didn't leave his wife in the sense of not coming back. He left her to go serve. So here you have this whole Canadian expedition in late 1775, early 1776, which was not going particularly well for the Americans. And in the spring of 1776, Congress decides to send a diplomatic mission up to Canada, still thinking they can salvage this thing. And the envoys they chose, 5 envoys, included the Carroll brothers from Maryland, Charles Carroll of Carrollton and John Carroll, his brother. Charles Carroll of Carrollton, you may know, is the only Roman Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence. His brother John was actually a Catholic priest. And the thinking is, this will help appease the French Catholics in Canada, sending a Catholic priest up to kind of get them onto our side. And also on this expedition is the 70-year-old Benjamin Franklin, who had only recently returned from London. He had been elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly and then had been elected to Congress. And now he is sent on this expedition because, of course, Franklin is the most famous American. And Franklin and the Carrolls and also Samuel Chase of Maryland get up, they make their way up by way of the Hudson River. And there's still like 6 feet of snow on the ground in upstate New York. This is early April of 1776. And they get up to Montreal, where they meet with General Arnold, and they see that this whole thing is a disaster. The Canadian expedition is really foundering. In fact, they've been expelled from Quebec, couldn't get Quebec, and now they're holed up in Montreal. And the thing that's going on is actually now trying to have an organized retreat. Washington, after lifting the siege of Boston, had sent General John Thomas up to Canada also to help with this evacuation of Canada, or retreat from Canada, or possibly holding on to Canada. One of the problems we have is we can't quite decide what we want to do here. Are we going to try to hold on, or are we just going to say, you know, this whole thing didn't work. The Canadians aren't going to join us. Let's cut our losses. And Franklin and the Carrolls meet with Arnold and meet with others and realize this, let's pull the plug on this. And so Franklin and John Carroll leave, leaving behind some of the others. Franklin said that the Canadians aren't providing any wagons to the Americans who are trying to get all their stuff out of Canada because the Canadians don't want the Americans to know they have any wagons. And Franklin says that our army here must either plunder, starve, or surrender, because there's no way they're going to get any supplies up in Canada. And so from Montreal, Franklin and John Carroll take to the road. They learn on the 6th of May that the British reinforcements have arrived at Quebec, which pretty much is going to end this whole affair for the Americans. And of course, another problem is going to make it all worse. I mentioned General Thomas coming up with reinforcements to Canada, and from Boston, they brought smallpox. So now this army, which is in the process of retreating, going back down the St. Lawrence and then down Lake Champlain, is stricken with smallpox. And Thomas dies of the smallpox in early June. And Franklin and Carroll also realize they have to take along a couple of people who are leaving Montreal. There was a couple named Walker, Mr. and Mrs. Walker, Thomas Walker and his wife, who had been their hosts in Montreal. And the Walkers were among the few Canadians who had welcomed the Americans when they had come up to Canada. And now the Americans are leaving, and the Walkers don't want to be left behind. And the Walkers blame the fact that now they have to leave on the Americans, on this American ineptitude, American incompetence. And Franklin and Carroll can recognize American incompetence. And they also feel duty bound to take the Walkers with them. And they're bringing the Walkers along with 3 wagon loads of their baggage as they're fleeing from their home in Montreal. And Franklin is suffering from the gout. One reason Reverend Carroll accompanies him is he feels badly for this old man suffering from the gout, doesn't want to leave him behind, and so helps Franklin and the Walkers down Lake Champlain and finally deposit the Walkers safely in Albany with their 3 wagon loads of baggage. Haven't charged them anything for this, and they part, as Franklin said, civilly, though coldly. And Franklin said, I think they both, that is the Walkers, have an excellent talent at making themselves enemies, which is why one reason they're leaving Montreal. And I believe, live where they will never be long without them, that is, without enemies. So, small story here about the Walkers. If any of you is descended from the Walkers, now you know how they arrived in upstate New York. I should say, John Carroll helping Franklin get back. This is another good reason for you to be kind to elderly people that you find needing help. 8 years later, Franklin was the American envoy in Paris. I'll be talking about that later on. And the Pope decided at that point that there should be an American bishop. And the papal nuncio called on Franklin to ask, would the Americans be receptive to having a Catholic bishop in residence in North America? And Franklin said, yes, they would. And I have just the person, Reverend Carroll, whom he remembered as being so helpful along the route. And this is why John Carroll became the first Catholic bishop in North America. And also he founded a college in Maryland shortly after this. Does anyone know the name of the college that the Reverend Carroll founded? Should we use the chat feature so you can put your guesses in, or to make this fully interactive?
Is it Colby College?
Was it what college?
Colby?
Colby? No. Good guess, though. I thank you for asking, for venturing a guess. I'll just leave that up there. That's that. And let us see, where were we in this course of the whole narrative? Okay, now there's another expedition happening too at the same time in the fall of 1775, early 1776. It's also a military, yes, Lila, you are right. Yeah, it wasn't me, I apologize. Thank you, Lila, it was Georgetown, okay. So, and this one involves South Carolina. The British ministry, realizing that the southern colonies wanted to remain part of the empire, decided to send a military force to help shore up the southern colonies. And just as it took Congress a long while to decide what exactly they wanted to do in Canada, it took the British ministry a long time to decide what they were going to do in the Carolinas. And ultimately they decide, why don't we send a fleet there? So while they are preparing to send a fleet from Ireland to the Carolinas, General Henry Clinton, who is in Boston, is going to the Carolinas with some ships and some soldiers. And his idea is he'll join up with this big British fleet, also with the loyalists in the area. He knew that in the backcountry of North Carolina, there were a lot of Scottish Highlanders. Many of them had arrived after 1745. You may know there was a big uprising in Scotland in the early 1740s, and a lot of Scottish Highlanders wind up going to North America to get away from the long arm of English revenge. And when they get to North Carolina, they do not become part of the resistance to the British Crown. Instead, they become ultra supportive of the British Crown. So the then governor in North Carolina, a guy named Martin, has this grand idea to get the Scottish Highlanders to rise up in his support, and the other loyalists in North Carolina join with this force coming from England and preserve North Carolina for the British Crown. At the same time, there's an idea that will also preserve South Carolina for the British Crown, something of a different story I'll get to in a minute. And the problem is these Highlanders on their march to the coast to come to the support of the governor and the others it turns out that the Patriots in North Carolina knew what they were doing, knew what these Highlanders were doing, and so actually stopped their advance at a place called Moores Creek Bridge in North Carolina. So the governor is on the coast in North Carolina. If you'll recall, when I was talking about the regulators, that's where the governor was. And he knows these reinforcements are coming from the interior, but suddenly the reinforcements aren't coming from the interior. And this fleet supposed to arrive from Great Britain never does. And then Sir Henry Clinton comes onto the scene, and Clinton is really kind of shocked at the fact that there aren't big groups of loyalists rising up to support the British Crown and for Governor Martin. In fact, on his way down to North Carolina, Clinton had stopped in Virginia, and he met there with the governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore. And Lord Dunmore is now living on a warship in Chesapeake Bay because he's been kicked out of the mainland, out of the land in Virginia. And so now here comes Sir Henry Clinton to help this governor in North Carolina, and he finds him living on an island, one of the sea islands. He does have a few of his enslaved people who are helping him out by catching crabs and things for him to eat. But this doesn't look like a way he's going to hold on to the loyalty of the people of North Carolina. However, Clinton is expecting this fleet to arrive from England, which is going to help him actually occupy Charlestown, South Carolina. Now, the problem is it's taken a while for this English fleet to arrive, and by this time, the Patriots in South Carolina realize what's happening. So they have occupied Charlestown, South Carolina, and the islands around it. Here's one of the things that really complicates the situation in South Carolina, and one of the reasons the British Crown really sees that this would be a good place to hold on to. About 60% of the people in South Carolina are actually enslaved. Neither side among the rulers, the Patriots or the Loyalists, want to have too long of a dispute going on because then these enslaved people could very likely rise up. Neither one really wants to try to use the enslaved people against the other because that's going to trigger all kinds of things. So you have in South Carolina a real desire simply to keep peace among the white rulers in South Carolina. It makes it a very complicated thing. And now with these anticipated arrival of a British fleet, the Patriots in South Carolina take the precaution of occupying Charlestown and let's see. This is Moores Creek Bridge. This is the governor of North Carolina. And here you see Charlestown Harbor. Lots of islands. This is the town of Charlestown here on a small peninsula. You have these big, wide rivers. And this area is called the Low Country. It's swampy, a lot of rice plantations along the coast. And here on these islands, there are a couple of forts and forts guarding the entrance. Now, General Clinton has seen a map very much like this. And here, this Sullivan's Island is occupied by the Patriot forces. Here you can actually see, and he sees a map that suggests that from Long Island to this island at low tide, it's pretty much dry land. So you could land the army here, a place that isn't fortified, and then just walk at low tide over to this island. That's the way he's going to bring the army. You can't have an amphibious landing here. In fact, amphibious landings weren't things that people did in this era. You don't have an amphibious landing under fire. So Clinton is on his way now to South Carolina. Once more of this British fleet from England arrives. He's already seen how badly things are in North Carolina, but Charlestown should be fairly receptive to having a British force occupying it for the reasons I mentioned. And so Clinton does have his army land here on Long Island and prepare to cross over. And wouldn't you know it, the map was wrong. You can't walk across at high tide. There's still 12 feet of water at low tide. There's still like 12 feet of water at low tide. So they start wading into this water and it gets deeper and deeper. And then they have to turn back because you can't really swim when you're trying to carry a weapon, keep your powder dry and so on. And well, then as they're doing this, of course, the men in the fort start firing on them. And the whole thing is a disaster for General Clinton. And he retreats from Charlestown, South Carolina. So the Patriots seem to have won this day here in Charlestown under this really difficult situation with Clinton being, not having enough support. Again, as I think I mentioned, General Clinton wrote a memoir of the war, and most things that went wrong were the fault of someone else. So that's enough about General Clinton and his travails in Charlestown, South Carolina. Okay, are there any questions about anything at all before I just start venturing on to something else? That's these two military episodes: disaster in Canada for the Americans, disaster in South Carolina for the British. Still unclear what the war is all about. Do the colonies simply want self-government, not to have to be taxed by Parliament? Or now is there something else in the offing? And the something else in the offing becomes apparent in January of 1776 with the publication of a pamphlet called Common Sense. Has anyone read Common Sense? Okay, Jordan has, and the rest of you are oblivious to the fact that this is on the reading list. Oh, Lisette, you've read Common Sense. Thank you.
I've read sections of it for a different.
Excuse me?
I've read sections of it for a different class. I've never read the whole thing.
You've never read the whole thing. It's not that long. I mean, I'm not blaming you for not having read the whole thing. Thomas Paine had arrived in, I've also given you an assignment to read an essay on Thomas Paine by Bernard Bailyn, which tells you more about Paine and what he was all about. He had actually left England as well as leaving his wife, not in the sense that General Montgomery left his wife, but in the sense that a real scoundrel leaves his wife and children. If any of you is a real scoundrel, if you left your wife and children, I don't go to the dean and saying that I'm saying mean things about you personally, but left his wife, children, and comes to America to seek his fortune. He had had a series of different jobs in England. He was a corset maker at one time. He was an excise tax collector at another time. And he arrives in America and he becomes an editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine. And he is actually fascinating guy for a lot of reasons. And it's unclear if he was hired to write Common Sense, but nobody knew who this guy was. So there's no reason he would put his name on it. So the pamphlet is simply written under the pseudonym of Common Sense. And one thing Paine had, Jordan or Lisette, do you want to say anything about the writing style? Since Lisette, you didn't actually read the whole thing, I didn't know how gripping you found it.
Well, I guess like for
You want to say
somebody,
anything about Common Sense? Jordan, have you read the whole thing?
yeah, I did. I read it this week for class. But I think like, did he freeze again? Okay. I think one thing that was really interesting was
That's mine.
that.
Okay.
Okay. I feel like,
Yeah.
yeah, okay. You kept cutting it out. Okay, so I just thought it was really interesting that for
I'm
somebody
sorry.
who wasn't here that long, it was really impassioned about like needing to be like governed a certain way. And he was very passionate about how he felt against the way monarchy in Britain currently had parliament being run. So I thought that was very interesting, especially since his history of barely being in the colonies that long.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty much all I have to say right now.
Yeah, that's you put that very well. The way he writes is passionate. That's one thing, and also he doesn't have a long history in the colonies, and he is able. He doesn't simply go through what has happened in the colonies. He is making an argument for something else. Am I still on? I still see people starting to move, which means my internet connection must be at least somewhat there. But, and he also argues against the prevailing ideas about how government should be created. And it's really an attack on monarchy. Remember, most of the argument the colonists had so far had been with Parliament. And what they seemed to be saying was, we'll be happy being part of the British Empire, but we think our assembly should govern us rather than Parliament. And Paine is saying that's not the problem. The real problem is the monarchy. So it is really an attack on this idea of monarchy and the whole idea of the British Constitution, which has a king, House of Lords, and a House of Commons. Well, why do you need a king? And he goes through the evolution of kings and the crowned ruffians of Europe, he calls them. And he says that government in its best state is a necessary evil. Interesting idea that it's, so he is attacking the idea of needing a monarch, needing a government. And if you have virtuous people, why do you need a government? So that is a much different idea from anything any of the Americans had been saying, but it's a liberating thing. And the way he writes gets a big, so the cause isn't simply self-government with the king, but self-government completely. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. You know, it's not just these Americans trying to get self-government, they're trying to create the world anew. And they have the chance to do this. When have any people had the chance to do this? Since the time of Adam and Eve. So he is making this argument against, as Jordan said, the way the government had worked. We've always kind of accepted this. Well, why? You should look at why we have these institutions and then decide whether you want them or not. And we have this opportunity now. And he also says that, maybe we should have, we should declare independence is essentially what he is saying. Now, if someone wrote a book today that sold as many copies as Paine's Common Sense did in the first 2 months of 1776, it would be on the bestseller lists. Now, this is at a time when there are like 1/10 of the population of the country now. So many people buy this book, very widely circulated, and no one knows who wrote it, because as I said, Thomas Paine is a nobody. Some people think John Adams might have written it because he seems to be the one in Congress who's been talking about independence the most. John Adams actually hated the book. He supported the idea of independence, but he thought Paine was really wrong about how government should be created. That's something we'll talk about later on. But Paine's common sense makes the argument, and in the appendix, he even talks about how much equipment the United States can muster. The fact that the United States can build ships and has able sailors and so on, that we should make use of this time to start doing these things, to use the resources here. You know, why should a continent, which North America is, be governed by an island? And so here it is the resources of America that will make it possible for these American colonies to become independent. So great book, which is on the reading list for good reason. And let's hope that you all have a chance to read it now that you've heard Jordan and talk about it. And you know, don't just rely on our gloss on it. So so this really does somewhat change the dynamic. And back in Congress, John Adams goes back to Congress in late April of 1776 after the evacuation of Boston. And it seems like now would be the time. But there's a lot of reluctance in Congress to take this step for reasons having to do with, you know, New England, of course, has always felt it could be independent. New York is different. There still is in New York a division about how we should be connected with the empire. Pennsylvania, about a third of the people in Pennsylvania are Quakers and don't like war. If any of you was a Quaker, I used to ask, is anyone here a Quaker? The dean told me to stop asking about people's religious affiliations. So if I do, some of you will note it and immediately tell the dean that I'm at it again. And next time you'll have someone else, probably with a better internet connection, teaching the class. So I'm not going to ask, is anyone here a Quaker? The Quakers don't bear arms. And so this is one reason Pennsylvania is kind of reluctant in this. Virginia, very much in favor of independence. South Carolina has that whole issue of the enslaved population, what happens with them. And so Congress is deliberating about what to do. And in the late 1775, actually, two of the colonies had consulted with Congress, South Carolina and New Hampshire. New Hampshire wanted to know what they should do. You know, in Massachusetts, the provincial Congress, which simply took the place of the old assembly, says, okay, we're going to keep governing under the old charter, but the office of governor is vacant. Okay, but we are operating under the old charter of 1691, which the Government Act of 1774 had abrogated, but we deny Parliament has the power to do that. So we're still operating under the old charter. You know, Connecticut and Rhode Island, no real problem because their charters don't mention the king anywhere. New Hampshire's does. New Hampshire has a governor appointed by the king, and according to the charter, everything has to be approved by the king. And now suddenly you have the governor no longer having the support of people. You have a provincial Congress in New Hampshire. And well, what's going to happen here? One thing assemblies like this have to do, two things they have to do. One is to tax people. And the other, if there is a war going on, they have to tell towns how many men they have to send to serve. Well, people are going to start asking this assembly, who's saying, okay, this is how much money you have to give us. And these are how many men have to now join this military force. They're going to start asking, what gives them the power to do this? Because they had been operating under a charter granted by the crown, but now they're just operating. Well, who gave them this power? So New Hampshire has that problem, and you'll start seeing the problem in much the same way. If somebody that doesn't have any authority, you've never consented to be governed by, starts telling you, pay up and risk your life on our behalf. South Carolina, similar problem. In there, they have this big problem because, as I said, 60% of the people are enslaved, and they want to have some kind of a government that can keep order there. But what authority do they have, since the governor now is living on this island in North Carolina, And this provincial Congress is operating as a provincial Congress, but what gives them the authority to do this? So they write to Congress saying, can you at least tell us what we should be doing? And what's the sense in the other colonies? And John Adams takes this very seriously. And John Adams, first, he writes a letter to various people about how governments should be organized. And on the 10th of May, the Congress draws up a resolution calling on these different provinces to draw up new plans of government to get them through this emergency. This is a tacit acknowledgement that the old governments under the charters are no more. It doesn't come out and say that, but it says these colonies have to have a new form of government that they draw up with some kind of a representative body determining it. And Adams sends out a blueprint for what kind of governments they should draw up. He says this is not a declaration of independence, but this in itself is a machine to fabricate independence. That is, once they've created new governments, they will be effectively independent. So that's what's happening here. It's kind of a complicated thing. And Congress also creates a couple of other committees. One is a committee to draw up treaties with foreign countries, and John Adams is on that. Another is a treaty to plan some kind of a currency, because of course, you need to print a lot of money in order to pay for this war we're now having. And also a committee that Franklin is on to create a new post office. Franklin, remember, had been the postmaster. And also there is a committee to draw up a Declaration of Independence. Okay, and that committee is the one that has Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, and Thomas Jefferson on it. Now, Jefferson had recently been added to the Virginia delegation, and he's unhappy with this assignment, being in Philadelphia, because at the same time in Virginia, the Virginia Provincial Congress is drawing up the Constitution for Virginia. That is the plan of government for Virginia. And Jefferson really wishes he was there doing that, because that's a lot more important than anything this committee he is on is going to do. And he does actually, in his spare time, does draft what he thinks would be a good constitution for Virginia, but it's, of course, not adopted. So you have these committees created in Congress, and Jefferson, Adams, Franklin are on the committee to draw up a Declaration of Independence. This is after a delegate from Virginia, Richard Henry Lee, has introduced a resolution from that Virginia convention calling for independence. You know, the Congress can't just say, hey, we want to be independent. They have to have one of the states saying we should be independent. This is one reason why the Massachusetts Congress was asking the towns in April of 1776 what they thought about independence. They really wanted to know. And the committee then is given this Virginia resolution saying that these 13 colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. And then the charge of this committee is to draw up an appropriate rationale for this. You know, everyone realized this was not the most important thing they were going to be doing. Adams spent most of his time on the committee drawing up treaties, because that was a much more important thing. Jefferson, as I said, wished he were in Virginia. Sherman, Livingston, busy with other things. So the work of doing this falls to Thomas Jefferson. Years later, Jefferson remembered his conversation with Adams about this. Adams, it was thought, would be the natural person to draw this up, since he had been talking about this for as long as there had been a Congress. But Adams was too busy. And he also told Jefferson, you should do this for three reasons. You know, one, Jefferson was a Virginian, and a Virginian really should be in front of this. Same reason Adams had wanted Washington to command the Continental Army. Everyone knew the New Englanders were kind of religious fanatics, were kind of whacked. And Virginia, though, biggest of the colonies, wealthiest of the colonies, and the Virginians commanded more respect than the people from Massachusetts did. So reason two, you're a Virginian. No, reason one, you're a Virginian. Reason two, you are popular well liked, respected. I'm the opposite. Reason 3, you write 10 times better than I do. So Jefferson's charge was to draw up a plan, a statement that everyone in Congress and everyone in the country could agree with. It wasn't meant to break new ground or introduce some new concept into American thinking. It was simply meant to explain what was the rationale for doing this in a way that people throughout the country could agree with. And also it was really meant to be placed before a candid world. So it begins when, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth that separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect for the opinions of mankind require they should declare the causes which impel them to this separation. Kind of a long sentence. We see it's necessary for this people to dissolve the bands which have connected them with another people, and to take that position to which they're entitled by the laws of nature and of nature's God. But they have enough respect for the people of the world to tell them why they're doing this. Fairly simple. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, instituting in its place a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. There's actually a lot going on here. These are the self-evident truths. Edward Jefferson has a very clear, logical mind, and this is an argument that he's been heard presenting, and he's written a couple of really influential pamphlets in the previous years. So he's not creating something new here. He's simply stating something they all agree to. All men are created equal. And that's something we can continue discussing. They have certain inalienable rights. Inalienable meaning rights that cannot be taken away. And these rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then the governments are created in order to preserve these rights. But when a government, instead of preserving these rights, is taking them away, then the people have a right to alter or to abolish that government. Then, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by altering the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, evincing invariably the same object, are designed to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. So, people aren't going to rebel for light reasons, transient reasons, but this long train of abuses and usurpations gives them the right, the duty to do this. So that's it. And then he says, such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former system of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And then there is a list of things the king has done. Refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good, forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. The striking thing about the list, two striking things about the list, it all is about the king. Remember, for 10 years, the argument had been about Parliament, what Parliament had done. But now the focus is on the king. what he has done. He has done this. He also has, in another place, it says that he has conspired with others to do this. The others are the members of parliament. That's the only time you have parliament referred to. So it is all about the king. The second really striking thing about this is, as I said, Jefferson has a clear, logical mind, and the structure of an argument like this is going to go from the less important of these things to the most important. That is, they're going to build in importance as you read. Refusing his assent to law is the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. And then it goes on about combining with others to do these things. The others, of course, being Parliament, to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws. And then it gets up to, he has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burned our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. Okay, compare that with refusing his assent to law as the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. And you'll see, we are really building in importance. And he is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages. And he has excited domestic insurrection among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. After this one, Jefferson had one saying, he has opened a market where men can be bought and sold. He has transported men who did him no harm here to be our slaves. So he's indicting the king for the African slave trade. But then he also says, and now he is trying to get these people who, as I said, never did him any wrong, to take it out on us. That is, getting the enslaved people to rebel against us. It is one of the most dazzling denunciations of the slave trade you're going to find in the horrors of slavery. But then he says also he's now getting these people to want to rebel against us. And he says that this is his opening of the slave trade, which he calls this execrable commerce, this piratical warfare, and this market where men can be bought and sold would be the opprobrium of any barbaric power, but is carried on by the Christian king of Great Britain. Congress excised that passage on the slave trade, much to Jefferson's great disappointment, because he thought it should be there. But then they said, well, it's kind of a contradiction to say the king brought about the slave trade when that's actually not true. And then he's getting the enslaved people to rebel against us. So the passage on the slave trade was the final one in this list of terrible things the King of Great Britain had done, but it is cut out by Congress. While we're on this subject, I mentioned that Jefferson was disappointed at not being in Virginia to help write the Constitution. And the Virginia Constitution, which George Mason did most of the work of writing, begins with a Declaration of Rights. As I said, governments are created to preserve rights. So when you see these newly independent states creating constitutions, they typically begin with a Declaration of Rights, what it is the government is supposed to protect. And Article 1 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights says, all men are created free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights, of which they cannot be divested. What do you think of that as a fundamental statement that George Mason thought everyone in Virginia could subscribe to?
I mean, obviously, slavery in Virginia was a big part of the economy, big part of the culture. So it's interesting that they would say something that, from a 21st century perspective, seems like it would be denouncing slavery, when in actuality, most of the people working on that document probably were slave owners.
Yeah, Mason owned 200 slaves, okay? Yeah. And he doesn't see a contradiction in this. But so what did he mean by all men are created equal or born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights? And that's the big question we continue to grapple with. And you see, it's really interesting in the part of Jefferson that he says all men are created equal at the beginning. That at the end, he's denouncing the king for opening a market where men can be bought and sold. You know, our easy answer typically is, well, they obviously didn't think that their enslaved people were actually people. But it seems to be contradicted by this. And then what happens in Virginia, as Ainsley said, 40% of the people in Virginia actually were enslaved. And other members of this assembly say, well, we really can't say that, since if all men have these natural, essential, and inalienable rights, how come 40% of the people in Virginia have been divested of these rights? It would be really easy if someone said, well, we don't really count them as people, but they don't. They say, okay, we'll have to amend that. All men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights, which when they enter into a state of society, they cannot be divested of which they cannot when they enter. So they create this idea, this fiction, that at some point, the ancestors of the people we enslave were not in a state of society, therefore they could divest themselves of these rights. And now here they are as slaves. They're creating this fiction about how these people came to be slaves in a similar way to the way Jefferson was creating a fiction that the king really created the slave trade. It shows them grappling with this and trying to make it fit. So Virginia's constitution says, you know, when you've entered into a state of society, you cannot be divested of these rights. Just to fast forward this to 1780, when John Adams is writing the Massachusetts Constitution, the Massachusetts Constitution begins with a similar Declaration of Rights, without that thing about these rights of which you cannot be divested. They don't add that part, and a couple of enslaved people in Massachusetts go to court. They say, how can I be held as a slave when the Massachusetts Constitution says all men are born free and equal? What do you think the court is going to say in Massachusetts? No, you don't count. Dylan, you're going to?
Sorry, what?
I thought you just, your screen went on. I thought you were about to answer the question.
Oh, sorry. That's my dog barking in the background. I didn't realize
Okay.
it wasn't on mute.
Oh, that's okay. Okay. So in Massachusetts, Quock Walker, Elizabeth Freeman, held as slaves. Long story about how they get to court. But I think if the general thinking is all men are created equal only applies to some men, it would be relatively simple for the court to tell them, you know, you have no business here. But that's not what the court does. The Massachusetts court says it seems to be the thinking of the people of Massachusetts by saying all men are created equal, that you cannot have someone who is held as a slave in Massachusetts. The really striking thing is what would have happened in Virginia had they not added that clause to create this fiction. So that's that about the Declaration and about this idea all men are created equal, and what exactly does that mean? And the Declaration goes on about we have not been wanting in our attentions to our British brethren, and we must act, but they've really blown it. They, you know, we've conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence, but they have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. Consanguinity is shared blood. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace friends. And therefore, the representatives of the United States of America and General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. They are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. So Congress adopts this, actually adopts independence, the Virginia Resolution declaring independence on the 2nd of July, and on the 4th of July, Congress adopts the Declaration, which then is printed, and it is because of that printing, which has a couple of things on it. I should have brought in this image of one of the printings of the Declaration. There are only about 26 of these that survived. They printed about 500 that night and the next day. It has in big letters at the top, July 4th, 1776, and also in big letters, United States of America. If you look at the manuscript of the Declaration, if you've been to the National Archives and seen it, United States of America isn't big. It says United is in small letters, and then States of America, and July 4th is in central. But it's the fact of that printing that makes both July 4th the anniversary day, and also makes the name the United States of America. Until the Civil War, people would use the phrase United States as a plural. The United States are, thinking is that these are states that are united. So, any questions on this? Let me just share with you something else. Jefferson, as I said, wrote this, and like anyone, he was sensitive about his writing. And then you have this committee, this whole Congress debating it line by line, saying, well, maybe that's not the best way of putting it. And you can imagine someone who's just spent all of his time writing this might feel a little sheepish about having his work criticized by a committee. And Jefferson happened to be sitting next to Benjamin Franklin. And this is a great story about writing. So I will share it with you now. Franklin remembered that a man named John Smith, that he knew, wanted to open a hat store. And so John Smith had a friend who was a sign maker make a sign. And on the sign, there was a picture of a hat. And it said, as you can see, John Smith at this address proposes to make and sell hats for ready money. And then he shows the sign to a friend. Friend says, proposes. Well, are you going to or aren't you going to? I want to know where I can buy a hat. Okay, that makes sense. Has the sign redone. John Smith at this address makes and sells hats for ready money. Shows it to another friend, and that friend says, at this address, why are you going to put up a sign at some other address rather than the one where you're selling the hats? Okay, that makes sense. We'll take out at this address. Shows the hat to another friend who points out that in this particular community, he says, no one actually expects you to sell a hat on credit. It's not the custom. You either have cash or you don't buy it. Well, that makes sense. John Smith makes and sells hats. So take out the for ready money. Shows the hat to another friend who says, when I want to buy a hat, I don't really care who made the hat. I just want to know where I can buy a hat. So why do you have makes hats? Why don't you just say John Smith sells hats? Shows the sign to another friend. That friend says, sells hats? Wouldn't expect you to give the hats away. So then the sign says John Smith hats, until someone passing by underneath it looks up at the sign and says, there's a hat and then there's the hats. The picture of the hat should be all you really need. So he's left with a sign that simply says John Smith and a picture of a hat. So as you're writing, remember this. What you really want to be left with is the picture of the hat. Cut out everything else and we'll all progress much better, okay? So that's today's sermon. Thank you all for sticking with it. Any last minute questions? Okay, well then I will see you next week. Have a good weekend. Tomorrow, remember, first day of October, so make the right adjustments, and I'll see you all on Monday.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, Professor.
Professor
Have a good
Allison,
weekend.
Yes,
I have a
Ainsley.
quick question if you have a
Okay.
second. What was the significance of Fort St. Jean in the Canadian campaign that you were talking about? Do you know?
Yes. It was like, why do you ask?
Well, I've been there. I did a reenactment there a couple of years ago.
Really?
So
Really?
I was just curious.
Okay. I know it was one of the places that Montgomery took on his way up. If I'm not mistaken, is at the entrance between the Richelieu River where it flows into the St. Lawrence. Is that right? Or am I thinking
I
somewhere
believe
else?
so, yeah.
So it's really
right
a
on the
critical,
water.
yeah, so it's really a critical place for that. And because he was able to take it, it means they then have access to the St. Lawrence. Had they
Mhm.
not, he wouldn't have had access to the St. Lawrence. So it's really this critical place when the Lake Champlain and the Richelieu River were really critical as part of this passageway. So yeah, thank you for asking. So that's it. And it was before they get Montreal. I mean, once they have that, they're able to get to Montreal.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye. Just leave.